Okay, this podcast is going to continue our talk on inheritance and Mendel's principles. We're going to pick up, we've introduced his ideas about traits being passed on in a segregated manner. We're going to look at how these are passed on with laws of probability that govern inheritance. First, we can start by mentioning some terms that refer to the makeup of the genes of the individual. So, um, in this cross here, where we have these individuals, we can look at their phenotype, which is their trait, their physical trait. And in this, we're looking at the flower color. Here is purple. So in these three individuals, we have three that have a purple phenotype, and we have one that has a white phenotype. But if we look at the genetic makeup of these individuals, they have two alleles for each trait, and those alleles can either be the dominant, which is the capital, always represented by a capital letter. In this case, it's two. This individual has two capital P's. That would be homozygous because they have the same. Homo refers to the same, and so there's two dominant alleles in that individual. This individual is homozygous recessive. They have two recessive alleles that are the same. These individuals are what's called heterozygous, and that means they have one dominant and one recessive, but they express the dominant trait. So they are heterozygous dominant. Now, in coming up with these, they get one of these alleles from the mother and one from the father, and they will pass on, if they have offspring, one of their alleles, just one gets passed on, because during meiosis that separates these, and only one allele goes to each gamete, and depending on which one gets fertilized, then that one will be passed on. And so they carry two genes, two different alleles. So in this case, they can only pass on a dominant allele. That's all they have. In these cases, they could pass on one dominant and one recessive. And so Mendel recognized that there are these laws of probability that dictate that. And that's kind of like the flipping of a coin. You can flip a coin. You have a 50-50 chance of getting a heads and a 50-50 chance of getting a tails, and then you can say the head represents the dominant allele, the tails represents the recessive, so there's a 50-50 chance. And so these are the possible outcomes of getting heads or tails, two heads or two tails, or one end, one tail, that type of thing. So you can see that as it plugs into the Punnett square there. Now, there's variations on Mendel's principles. Now, the principle is that you pass on one of these alleles and the dominant will out-express the recessive. But there are some variations on this. One of the variations is incomplete dominance. And so incomplete dominance is when we have an allele that is not completely dominant over another allele. Such as this case here with these snapdragons. We have a red allele and a white allele for the different flower colors. When these are crossed, you actually get a pink trait in that flower color. Now, it's not a blending. It kind of is an in-between expression of the traits, but it's not a blending of the traits. It's just that neither one of the alleles dominate over the other allele. So it's different from that blending hypothesis that we talked about, but it is referred to as incomplete dominance. Another variation is something called multiple alleles. Now, most uh, um, most genes exist in a population in more than just two allelic forms. And so for this, for each trait, there'll be multiple alleles in the population. Now, you'll only be carrying two, one from mother, one from your father, but in the population, there's more than just the two that you carry. So a good example of this is the ABO blood group that we have in our human population. So you can see that in this we have a possibility of 4 different phenotypes. And so in the ABO blood group, it's determined by the enzyme. So you carry enzymes, and these will have carbohydrates added to them. And so you can have carbohydrate that's carbohydrate A, carbohydrate B, or you can have both carbohydrate A and B, or you can have neither carbohydrate A or B. And so those are the 4 possible outcomes in your blood type. And so that is a called a multiple allele when you in the human population. In this case, you carry more than just 2 allelic forms. Another example that we mentioned in the outline there is pleiotropy. Pleiotropy is when there's one gene that influences a number of different characteristics. So this one gene is responsible for more than just one trait or outcomes, or in the case of disorders, symptoms. And so an example that we give in your outline there is sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is has a number of symptoms associated with it that you're responsible for, but it's traced just to one gene. So if you have an error on that one gene, then it causes sickling of your cells, which gives a number of symptoms to that individual. So we would call that pleiotropy because there's a number of different particular traits that and symptoms that would result from that one gene. Now, in tracking this, we can do what's called a pedigree. A pedigree is when we trace one particular trait down through a number of generations. And so pedigrees are important, especially when looking at in medical histories in the past. You can track some of these through pedigrees. So you can see this dominant recessive alleles of widow's peak and attached or free earlobes, and you can track that down through generations. Now you can, again, carry alleles that are recessive, and they only become expressed when both mates carry them. This would go true for disorders as well. There's a number of disorders that are recessive that we all carry alleles of those disorders, but they will generally not be expressed because the likelihood of our mate carrying that exact same recessive disorder is unlikely, and unless you're marrying your cousin and that kind of thing. So because you have closer genetic linkage, the closer you are related to that individual. So so you're more likely to carry genes and even disorders to someone you're closer related to. But those are recessive. There are some dominant inherited disorders. Your book mentions this one here. Dwarfism is a dominant inherited disorder that anytime you carry that gene, you exhibit that dwarfism. So dwarfs are individuals that have this this disorder, and so they carry that. Now, some dominant inherited disorders, if they are do not get passed on in populations if they are very harmful, especially if they're lethal. They're going to die. The individual will die out and not pass that disorder on. So there's not as near as many dominant inherited disorders as recessive inherited disorders, because we can all carry those and they just maintain in the population without getting passed on or without getting expressed. Let's see. Okay, I think that's about where we end for our kind of continuation of inheritance. Next, we're going to go into looking at the connection between our chromosomes and our DNA to this inheritance and how they're tied to first our chromosomes, and then we'll look at how they're tied to our DNA.